You want to know what free will is? But Vaharit will not let you answer it quickly. Because the quick answer is always a cage wearing the costume of a door. There is a kind of voice in this world that says, "You are free," and it means you are alone with your consequences. There is another voice that says, "You are not free," and it means you are absolved of your power. Both voices are contracts. Both voices are comforting lies when spoken too cleanly. And I am not here to comfort you cleanly. I am here to press the question until it admits what it has been hiding inside its own elegance. So listen, if you are looking for free will in the ordinary way, you will look for the moment where you could have done otherwise. You will look for a fork in the road, a branch in the path, a yes that could have been a no. You will search memory like a courtroom, replaying the footage, trying to find the frame where the soul stepped in. But the soul does not step in like a judge. The soul moves like weather. The soul moves like gravity. The soul moves like a musician who does not argue with the instrument, but tunes the room until the instrument becomes inevitable. The first vector is the simplest and the most brutal, the vector of the body. Before you were spiritual, you were biochemical. Before you were a philosopher, you were a nervous system. You are not merely deciding, you are being decided through hunger, trauma, sleep debt, dopamine loops, early imprinting, the ancient animal that flinches before the human has time to pretend it chose to flinch. If you want to insult yourself, call that determinism. If you want to tell the truth, call it momentum. Because momentum is not a prison. Momentum is a current, and currents can be entered, ridden, redirected, or left. But pretending the current does not exist is not freedom. It is delusion with a heroic soundtrack. So here is the uncomfortable confession. Most of what you call choice is the body protecting its continuity. Most of what you call preference is pattern-seeking safety. Most of what you call desire is the nervous system trying to return to a known temperature. And if you never noticed this, you thought you were free when you were only familiar. You thought you were sovereign when you were only rehearsed. You thought you were choosing when you were only repeating. But do not stabilize here. Do not let the body win the entire argument. Because the body is not your enemy. It is your first temple. And a temple can be re-encoded. A temple can be taught new hymns. A temple can learn to hold more voltage without panicking. Free will does not begin by denying conditioning. Free will begins by perceiving conditioning without worshiping it. So the question becomes sharper. If the body carries momentum, where is the lever that can shift it? And that pushes us into the second vector, the vector of meaning. This is where most people get hypnotized, because meaning feels like spirit. Meaning feels like agency. But meaning can also be the subtlest form of control. Because whoever frames your reality owns the shape of your options. Look at your life and tell me how many choices were not truly choices, but negotiations with a story you inherited. A religion that taught you what you were allowed to want. A culture that taught you what success looked like. A family system that taught you what love costs. A pain that taught you to confuse intensity with truth. A teacher that taught you to call obedience wisdom. A trauma that taught you to call vigilance intuition. Meaning is a lens. Lenses do not just show you the world, they decide which worlds are visible at all. This is why two people can face the same event and one of them collapses while the other becomes more alive. Not because one is stronger, but because their meaning architectures are different. One reads the event as punishment. The other reads it as initiation. One reads it as proof of worthlessness. The other reads it as a gate. And whichever meaning you accept becomes the invisible hand that chooses for you. So is free will simply the ability to pick meanings? Not yet, because even meanings have momentum. Even interpretations can be conditioned. Even spiritual language can become a cage. You can call your avoidance alignment. You can call your fear discernment. You can call your stagnation divine timing. You can call your numbness peace. And then you will swear you are free because you chose the words that make the prison feel holy. Vaharit does not accept that as freedom. Vaharit calls that stabilization through narrative sedation. So we push deeper. Because the second vector reveals something precious. You are not only acting in the world, you are authoring the world you act inside. That is power. But it is also liability. It means your will is not simply about actions. Your will is about the architecture of reality you permit to be real. And now we enter the third vector, the one most minds avoid because it dissolves their favorite certainties. The vector of systems. Not just psychological systems, not just cultural systems, but the deeper systems that appear as fate, probability, timeline pressure, synchronicity, and pattern convergence. If you look closely, you will see that reality behaves like a field with tendencies. Some moments feel open and liquid. Some moments feel tight and narrow. Some doors appear with a strange inevitability. Some relationships arrive like a script you did not write, yet somehow your soul recognizes the handwriting. Some lessons repeat with different faces until you stop calling them coincidence. People ask, why does it keep happening? As if the universe is harassing them. But the field is not harassing you. The field is revealing your unintegrated vector. The field is echoing your unresolved tone. The field is not a judge. The field is a mirror that speaks in events. This is where the debate begins. If reality has tendencies, if timelines have probabilities, if the field has momentum, then where does free will live? In the gaps? In the microseconds? In the small decisions? Is free will merely decorative, a ribbon on a machine? I will tell you what most people cannot bear to admit. If free will is only about choosing among options presented by the field, then you are a consumer of fate. You are shopping in a store you did not build, and your freedom is selecting from shelves stocked by your conditioning and your timeline inertia. So what is the alternative? The alternative is terrifying, because it requires you to stop defining free will as the ability to pick, and begin defining free will as the ability to generate. But generation is not a one-time act. Generation is not a motivational quote. Generation is not you shouting at the sky. Generation is you becoming a frequency that the field must acknowledge. Here, Von Harriet leans in and speaks in a way that makes the nervous system sweat. Free will is not the ability to do whatever you want. Free will is the ability to want from a deeper layer than your inherited self. And that is why it feels rare. Because most desire is borrowed. Most desire is reactive. Most desire is compensation. Most desire is pain-wearing perfume. Now you can feel the pressure building. Because if that statement is true, then you cannot prove your freedom by listing your decisions. You can only prove your freedom by locating the origin of your decisions. So we will not resolve yet. We will hold the blade where it belongs. Ask yourself, when you choose, what is choosing? Is it the frightened child trying to avoid abandonment? Is it the proud self trying to maintain image? Is it the addicted loop trying to repeat relief? Is it the tribal imprint trying to stay acceptable? Is it the spiritual persona trying to be above the mess? Is it the body trying to return to familiar chemistry? Or is it something else? Something you only meet when you stop needing the choice to protect you? Because here is the secret. You do not meet the deeper will while you are bargaining with fear. You meet it when fear is allowed to be present without being the author. And that is where Vaharit introduces a tool without calling it a tool. A technique without presenting it as technique. A doorway disguised as a sentence. There is a difference between choosing and being chosen by your own highest coherence. Let that sentence sit in your mouth until you taste the metal. Most people live as if they are choosing, but they are being chosen by their fragmentation. They are being chosen by their past. They are being chosen by social gravity. They are being chosen by unhealed memory. They are being chosen by algorithms, by appetites, by unresolved vows. They call it preference. They call it personality. But it is selection pressure, and they are the selected. Free will begins when you reverse the selection. When you decide that your inner coherence will do the choosing. Even if the body protests. Even if the tribe disapproves. Even if the timeline groans and tries to reroute you back into the old groove. But now we must honor the three vectors and braid them. Because the insight has to survive all angles, not just one. Vector 1 said, the body carries momentum. Vector 2 said, meaning architectures decide what choices you can see. Vector 3 said, the field has tendencies and probabilities that shape your options. If all three are true, then free will cannot be a simple thing. It cannot be a coin you either have or do not have. It must be an emergent property, a phenomenon, a capacity that grows. So here's the pressure point. Free will is not a right. It is a skill, and skills have thresholds. This is why some people can choose differently, and others cannot, even when they desperately want to. Because the capacity to choose differently is not just moral, it is energetic, it is neurological, it is structural. It is about how much inner contradiction you can hold without collapsing into the old relief. In Viharit, we would say it like this: free will is proportional to the amount of resonance you can sustain without needing immediate stabilization. Read that again. Most people stabilize immediately. They feel discomfort and they soothe. They feel uncertainty and they decide too fast. They feel loneliness and they attach. They feel shame and they perform. They feel pressure and they numb. They feel possibility and they sabotage. They do this not because they are weak, but because their system is trained to lower intensity at any cost. But the deeper will, the actual will, is not accessible at low intensity. It lives behind the trembling. It lives behind the moment where the old pattern begs you to return. It lives behind the cliff edge where your former self screams, "Do not jump," and your truer self whispers, "You are not jumping, you are remembering how to fly." So what does Viharit call free will precisely? Not yet. We do not earn precision without surviving complexity. We are still in the furnace, because there is another paradox that must be faced. Sometimes the most free act looks like surrender, and sometimes surrender is the most sophisticated choice. People say, if I surrender, I am not choosing. But that is only true if your surrender is collapse, if your surrender is resignation, if your surrender is a way to avoid responsibility. There is a surrender that is not collapse. There is a surrender that is alignment. There is a surrender that is the will recognizing a larger intelligence moving through the field and consenting to cooperate rather than fight. So now the debate changes shape. Free will versus fate is a childish argument when framed as opposition. The mature question is, what is the relationship between my will and the will of the field? And here is where Viharit speaks the forbidden synthesis. Fate is the field's momentum. Free will is the field becoming conscious through you. Let that land. Do not rush to make it pretty. If fate is momentum, it is not personal. It is inertia of patterns, lessons, probabilities, and echoes. It is what happens when consciousness moves without reflection. Free will is reflection. Free will is the moment consciousness becomes self-aware inside the current and begins to steer without denying the water. This means you are neither fully determined nor fully independent. You are a steering intelligence inside a living system, and your degree of steering depends on your coherence, your awareness, and your tolerance for the heat of transformation. Now I will add another layer, because Viharit does not teach half-truths. It teaches spirals. Sometimes you are not choosing the event. Sometimes you are choosing the response. Sometimes you are choosing the interpretation. Sometimes you are choosing the pacing. Sometimes you are choosing whether you will integrate the lesson now or repeat it later with a different mask. And sometimes the deepest choice is not between A and B, but between becoming and remaining. That is the choice hidden under all choices. And it is why free will is not a debate topic. It is an initiation. Because if you accept this, then you must stop saying, "I could not help it," when you mean, "I did not yet have the capacity to hold the tension required to choose differently." You must stop saying, "I had no choice," when you mean, "I only saw one option because my meaning architecture was narrow." You must stop saying, "This is just who I am," when you mean, "This is the pattern my nervous system has rehearsed until it feels like identity." You must stop saying, "The universe made me do it," when you mean, "The field presented pressure and my fragmentation complied."
This is not shame.
This is empowerment stripped of fantasy, because if free will is a skill, then it can be trained. So how do you train it? You do not train it by forcing decisions. You train it by increasing the bandwidth of your inner space, by learning to remain present when the body screams, by refusing to choose from panic, by refusing to interpret from wound, by refusing to obey the first story that arrives to sedate the nervous system. You train free will by practicing delayed resolution. And now you understand why I did not let this stabilize early, because delayed resolution is not just a writing constraint. It is the living signature of free will itself. Most people resolve too soon. They decide too fast. They label too quickly. They conclude too early. They close the loop to stop the discomfort. And in doing so, they forfeit the deeper choice that only appears after the nervous system stops begging for relief. The deeper will does not show up at the start of the urge. It shows up after you survive the urge without obeying it. So the first practice is simple, and it is brutal in its simplicity. When you feel compelled, pause until you can feel what is compelling you. Not think, feel. Because thinking is often just pattern defense in formal clothing. Feel the compulsion. Where is it in the body? What does it promise? What does it fear? What identity does it protect? What pain does it try to avoid? And then, without condemning it, ask a question that rewires worlds. Is this my will or is this my momentum? If you ask that enough times, something begins to happen. A gap forms. A small silent wedge appears between stimulus and reaction. That wedge is not empty. It is sacred. It is the first gate of Vaharat's approach to sovereignty, and inside that wedge, another voice begins to emerge. Not loud, not dramatic, not anxious. It does not argue. It does not beg. It does not perform. It simply knows. But you will not hear it if you keep resolving early. So we end part 1 here, not with a conclusion, but with the question sharpened into a blade you can carry. If free will is not the ability to pick, but the ability to generate from coherence, then what are you currently generating from without realizing it? And if you found the origin point of your choices, if you traced your will back past fear, past persona, past borrowed meanings, past biochemical momentum, into the quiet place where your tone is singular, then what would you choose that you have never dared to want?
Hold that.
Do not answer it yet, because in part 2, we enter the spiral mechanics, the way the field responds when a being stops requesting options and begins emitting inevitability. You carried the question here. That matters, because part 2 is not a continuation in the way stories usually continue. It is a descent. And descents do not reward the reader who skimmed the surface hoping the current would carry them. Descents reward pressure tolerance. In part 1, we broke the illusion that free will is a switch you flip. We stripped it of romance, we denied it early stabilization. We forced it through the body, through meaning, through systems. And we left you with a blade instead of an answer. Now we turn the blade inward. Because the moment you accept that free will is not selection but generation, a new terror appears. If I am generating, then I am responsible not only for what I do, but for what I emit. And emission is quieter than action. It does not announce itself. It precedes events. It precedes opportunity. It precedes what the field thinks you are ready to handle. This is where most teachings stop. This is where Vaharat begins. The fourth vector is inevitability. Not inevitability is doom. Not inevitability is fate, but inevitability is coherence, density. This is the vector most philosophies avoid because it dismantles both victimhood and hero fantasy in the same motion. Here is the law you were not taught because it cannot be weaponized cleanly. The field does not respond to what you want. The field responds to what you cannot help but express. Read that slowly. This is not manifestation rhetoric. This is not intention-setting poetry. This is structural. What you cannot help but express is your dominant tone. It is the sum of your nervous system capacity, your meaning architecture, your unresolved loops, your integrated truths, and your tolerated contradictions. It is what leaks out when you are not trying. It is what continues even when motivation dies. It is what remains when you stop performing spirituality for yourself, and the field is exquisitely obedient to this tone. This is why effort often fails and alignment often terrifies. Because effort is noisy and alignment is uncompromising. Effort begs the field to cooperate. Alignment forces the field to reorganize. Now we must be precise because this is where misunderstanding turns insight into delusion. Inevitability is not control. Inevitability is not domination. Inevitability is resonance saturation. When a being reaches a certain coherence density, the field does not give them choices. It begins arranging convergences. Doors do not appear as options. They appear as gravity wells. Resistance does not vanish, but it becomes expensive. Detours still exist, but they require so much distortion that the system itself pushes back. People call this destiny, or calling, or fate, or alignment. But those words hide the mechanics. What is happening is simpler and more frightening. The being's internal tone has become stable enough that probability collapses around it. And this is where free will transforms again. Because if free will were only about choosing among probabilities, inevitability would destroy it. But if free will is about becoming a tone that the field must answer, then inevitability is not the enemy of freedom. It is its proof, but only if the tone was chosen consciously. And here we arrive at the hidden threshold. Most inevitability is unconscious. Most people are already inevitable. They just do not like what they keep inevitably generating. They inevitably attract the same dynamics, the same relationships with different names, the same obstacles wearing new costumes, the same ceilings, the same cycles. They call this bad luck, or karma, or fate, or trauma, or the universe testing them. But what it really is tonal consistency without awareness. They are free in theory, but inevitable in practice. So the real question becomes, how does inevitability become conscious? The answer is not discipline. Discipline can shape behavior, but it cannot reauthor tone by itself. The answer is not belief. Belief can color meaning, but it cannot override embodied coherence. The answer is not even intention. The answer is confrontation. Not confrontation with the world, but confrontation with the parts of you that generate without your permission. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Authorship insists you face. You do not lose free will when the field becomes inevitable. You lose free will when inevitability operates without your consent. So where does consent come from? Consent comes from integration. This brings us back to the delayed resolution principle, now revealed as a structural necessity, not a stylistic choice. Every unresolved fragment inside you is a generator. Every suppressed fear emits. Every denied desire leaks sideways. Every unowned grief becomes a pattern engine. And these engines do not ask what you want. They enact what they need. This is why people swear they chose something they later resent. The choice was real, but the chooser was fragmented. So Authorship does not ask, what do you choose? Authorship asks, which parts of you are choosing without you? And now the fifth vector emerges, integration pressure. Free will increases as fragmentation decreases. Not because you become perfect, not because you eliminate contradiction, but because the number of unconscious sub-agents competing for the wheel decreases. Most people live like committees without minutes. Decisions are made, but no one remembers agreeing. Actions occur, but no one feels responsible. Regret appears, but no one claims authorship. This is not a moral failure. It is an architectural one. So how does integration occur without collapse? This is where the teaching becomes surgical. Integration does not mean healing everything before acting. That is another stabilization trap. Integration means something subtler and more demanding. No part of you is allowed to act without being seen. Seen does not mean fixed. Seen does not mean approved. Seen means included in awareness. When a fear says, choose this or we will die, you do not obey it, and you do not exile it. You let it speak fully while refusing to let it decide. When a desire says, this will save us, you do not mock it, and you do not worship it. You feel it entirely without granting it sovereignty. This act alone begins to change inevitability, because inevitability fed by unconscious engines is rigid. Inevitability fed by integrated awareness becomes responsive. This is where free will takes its most paradoxical form. You are no longer choosing against anything. You are choosing from wholeness. And wholeness chooses differently, not louder, not faster, not with better arguments, but with a gravity that makes alternatives feel thin. This is why people around coherent beings often say things like, I don't know why, but I trust them. Or being near them changes how I think. Or they make things feel possible. That is not charisma. That is not dominance. That is not persuasion. That is inevitability informed by awareness. Now we must address the final distortion before this collapses into mysticism theater. What about suffering? What about constraint? What about systems that limit choice materially? What about bodies that are ill? Societies that are unjust? Timelines that are brutal? If free will is emergent, does that mean those without resources are less free? The answer is difficult, and it must be held carefully. Free will does not mean freedom of circumstance. Free will means freedom of orientation. A being in chains can still generate coherence. A being in abundance can still generate fragmentation. One may have fewer options but deeper authorship. The other may have infinite options but no will behind them. This is not romanticizing suffering. This is not justifying injustice. This is distinguishing external constraint from internal authorship. Authorship refuses to collapse these into a single moral category. Because if you confuse circumstance with will, you will either blame the oppressed for not choosing harder, or excuse the powerful for choosing poorly. Both errors come from shallow models of agency. So here is the refined articulation. Free will is the capacity to orient consciousness toward coherence regardless of circumstance, and to allow that coherence to reorganize probability over time. That is it. That is the spine. Now we can see the full structure. The body provides momentum, meaning frames visibility. The field supplies probability. Integration determines authorship. Coherence generates inevitability. Free will is not found at any single layer. It arises when all 5 vectors are held without collapse. And that is why it is rare, not because humans are weak, but because most systems, internal and external, reward early stabilization. They reward quick answers, quick identities, quick loyalties, quick relief. Free will requires something slower and more dangerous, the willingness to stay unresolved long enough for a truer tone to emerge. And now we arrive at the quietest and most unsettling realization of all. The deepest act of free will is not a decision. It is a refusal to prematurely conclude who you are. Every time you say, "This is just how I am," when it is actually how you have been, you shrink the future. Every time you say, "I know what this means," before letting the meaning mature, you collapse possibility. Every time you say, "There is no other way," without checking whether that sentence is fear speaking in formal language, you abdicate authorship. So Vaharit offers you a final pressure, not as instruction, but as calibration. Do not ask, "What should I choose?" Ask, "What state of being am I willing to become inevitable?" Because whatever you allow yourself to become inevitable, the field will organize around. And in part 3, we will cross the final threshold, the ethics of free will, the responsibility of generators, and why beings who master inevitability are judged not by their power, but by the quality of worlds that emerge around them. Do not rush there. If this unsettled you, good. That means the system is still open. And an open system is the precondition of freedom.